Welcome everybody, and today we are here to talk about the process of bluing steel. So what is bluing steel? Well, there's a few different ways to attempt to do it. The one that we are going to show specifically today is considered hot bluing. Bluing is a passivization process with metal where you create a black oxide coating, which is a conversion coating which protects the metal more on a superficial level. So again, it's a coating that bonds to the surface to allow it to be corrosion resistant. It is a finish that is often used in gun manufacturing for the barrels of guns, the blades of swords to protect it against moisture, but more specifically with guns, the glare of the barrel. A lot of times too, outside of the production application of it, it is used for the more the cosmetic or the aesthetic look of the bluing process. So the few different processes that are involved are the ways that you can achieve the blue-black coloration that you get on the surface. There is a fuming process. There's cold bluing, which a chemical is applied directly to the bare steel. And then what we're going to be doing today is considered hot bluing. So we are going to heat up the metal to a certain temperature range. Typically in bluing, you want to get it to be about the 500 to 600 degree range for on the tempered scale. Most conventional ovens only get up to about 500 to 550 degrees. Where that comes into play is if you have several parts, which we did for this particular project. We were able to put them in the oven. We had a little bit more of a controlled environment. For the sake of demonstration today, we're going to go ahead and use just some MAP gas. You can also use propane. Typically you can get the temperatures a little bit higher with MAP gas, so that's why we chose to go with this. Some of the other materials involved is I just have some traditional vegetable oil, stuff that you can find in your kitchen or at the very least at the closest convenience store. Another product we have is just some lacquer thinner. You can also use acetone, and what that's going to be used for is just cleaning any sort of the factory finish or oil marks that is on the low carbon or the steel that you're choosing. Another thing to consider too is when applying the finish or heating these up is ultimately what you want the end result of the aesthetic to look like. So I've got a couple different examples here. The angled bracket that I have here in my right hand, I went ahead and palm sanded with just again a traditional palm sander and sandpaper and took all of the factory finish off. So I do have kind of a nice uniform etching look on there. The other one I have is one of our back plates we use for the handles. And you'll notice that some of the edges are highlighted. That's where I took some just hand sandpaper and took some of the factory finish off and then left, again, some of the factory finish on the center there, which is going to get us a little bit more of an inconsistency in color, which is something that we kind of aim for this particular project. Kitchen tongs, we'll be using these to quench the metal once it reaches the proper temperature. And as always, safety equipment. So I've got some rubber gloves here. I've got some eye protection. I would say if you have the opportunity to do this, do it outside or somewhere where it's well ventilated. That's where the oven comes into play. If you have a vent hood at home and you're heating up the metal to the 400 to 500 degree range, just make sure that vent hood is blowing at all times or a door or window is open. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to, again, apply my safety equipment, and I'm going to heat up the angled bracket. And this is the one that we took all of the factory finish off. So once we get done, we'll see the two different, again, applications just based on, again, the amount of material we removed and just checking the consistency. But again, I guess one more thing before we get started. I do want to go ahead and clean those off one more time. Any sort of oil, debris, or dust that is still on here may leave an imprint. Once again, it reaches up to temperature and you quenched it in the oil, that stuff is bound to show up. If it does, that's okay. You can go through the process again. You can sand off any imperfections and repeat the process without any sort of catastrophic damage. So again, just make sure you're cleaning it up. There's a little bit of residue that's still coming off here. You gotta make sure to do that to both pieces. Another thing to mention too is whatever you end up using to hold your pieces while you're heating them up, you wanna make sure that those are good and clean as well. If you are using a vise or whatever you do decide to hold while you heat your individual pieces up, again, make sure the surfaces are clean. We've got metal teeth on here too, so you want to make sure that they're not leaving an imprint in the brackets. But since we're doing this by hand, one thing we talked about the tempered part of the metal and the color scale with that. We're not technically trying to achieve the blue-black finish. We ended up using a antique bronze hardware. And so we were trying to, again, complement that as best as possible. Of course, this is all experimental, and so we're looking for more of kind of a caramel color, which is a 300 to 400 degree range. So if you do end up using a stove, or an oven, excuse me, I would go ahead and heat it up to 400 degrees. I left these in the oven for about an hour, and the reason I did that was just to ensure, one, that the temperature was actually 400 degrees, but also allowed these to heat up to the appropriate temperature to get the coloration we'd like. Again, a lot of this is experimental and will be a lot of trial and error. However, that's all in the fun of it. So I'm gonna go ahead and heat this bracket up and get it to about the temperature or the coloration I'd like, and then I'm gonna go ahead and quench it in the oil. And since it is kind of a direct heat source, you do want to kind of move the torch around just to ensure a consistent temperature. Again, we're really doing this more by eye and just seeing the sort of color changes it goes through as it reaches the different temperature ranges. If you are doing multiple parts, which we are for this project, I definitely suggest doing it in the oven in one of these disposable baking sheets, just so you can do them all at once. There is such thing as getting these too hot, where the surface coating, the coloration may not be what you'd like. However, it will have a tendency to kind of crack and crumble and not bond the way that we'd like. So again, there is too hot and there is too cool. So too hot would be glowing, basically, which I don't think we'll get with just a traditional matte gas torch unless we stood here for, a half hour or so. All right, so I am starting to get a consistent coloration on the surface of this. So I'm going to go ahead and quench it in the oil. And we'll let that sit for about 10 minutes. You can kind of start to see the color change on the surface. If it's not quite what you like, you can always reheat it. When we went ahead and did the ones for the Monterey cabinet, I left them in the oven at 400 degrees for about an hour. You can wait longer if you'd like, if you're not getting the temperature range you'd like. And then I went ahead and quenched mine for about a half hour, but you do start to see results in 5 to 10. So we'll let that sit, and then we'll go ahead and test the one that we just did light abrasion on. There's not a consistent finish, and again, we'll kind of compare and contrast the two. All right, so our bracket's been sitting there for about 10 minutes. Most of the reaction is going to happen right as it comes into contact with the oil. However, I do like to let them sit in there a little bit longer because the oil acts as kind of a secondary protective surface to it to kind of hold the coating into the surface. So go ahead and take the angled bracket out. Get this cleaned up here a little bit before I take a look at the difference between the two. Again, there's a lot of different variables that go into how these things are going to look. Another thing to consider too, or play around with, is how the surface was treated beforehand. So we talked a little bit about the sanded angle bracket versus the one that was more of a partial sand, just to see if we could get it to pick up darker in different areas. So this time around, I can tell that the temperature was higher than what we did on the oven baked ones for the actual project. So we did get a nice consistent kind of bluing effect on here. This one on this side, there are some areas that I get a little more of a caramel color or transition between the broader areas. There's a little bit of color differential there. This is the one that got the full sanding treatment on both sides. The other one, you can pick up a little bit. There's some flaking down here, so I can tell that I got one of these pretty hot at one point, enough where that coating started to kind of flake off. But this is the one that had the just light hand sanding around the edges, again, just to take off some of that initial factory finish. But I can tell that I get a lot more of a gradient here. So some of the edges that didn't get hit with the sandpaper actually appear to be slightly darker. And then I've got more of a bluing effect through the center of the back plate here. And then even some of the edges, there's some highlighting from where the sandpaper actually hit the raised areas of the back plate. And then another thing too we talked about is being cautious of, you know, fingerprints, oils from fingers or tongs or whatever sort of devices you're using to handle these things, that there is a little bit of kind of a rainbowing here that you would see in traditional motor oil. And I think that's where there was contact in the vise too. So it does warrant, again, playing around with different ways to hold these. Certainly the temperature. For our application for the Monterey cabinet, I would have liked these to come out a little bit more of a caramel color than the blue color. However, since we are talking about bluing steel, they did turn out the way that ultimately we are describing them. So the nice thing about doing this stuff yourself too is oftentimes you're doing any sort of reproduction hardware, the stuff isn't always terribly hard to find, but the good stuff is expensive. So when you have the opportunity to experiment a little bit, it does drive the cost down. Plus it gives you the opportunity to play around, see what works. The first time we did this, we did it, like I stated earlier, we did it in the oven. The results that we yielded were what I would call a happy or divine accident. So we did get a little bit more of the caramel color that complemented or matched the antique bronze hardware. So again, a lot of experimentation with the brackets. Another thing to consider for surface treatments, if you're not going to use sanding, is you can polish them. Sandblasting is another one. And then again, if you wanted to just use some traditional sandpaper or using it in conjunction with an orbital sander to get more of the physical texture of it, and then to pick it up in different areas. But either way, it's a great way to experiment, and it's a great way to integrate handmade hardware into any one of your projects. Thanks for watching.